In the forgotten hills of rural Kentucky, a state worker walked into a compound that should never have existed. What he found wasn't just neglect. It wasn't just poverty. It was a living experiment in bloodlines, a deliberate collapse of family. Boundaries that produced 12 children caught in the grip of genetic disaster. Their fathers were their uncles. Their brothers were also their cousins. And the men behind it all believed they were following God's will. For years, they built their own hidden world, cut off from society, convinced that purity meant keeping the bloodline closed, no matter the cost. What investigators uncovered in 2003 wasn't just a family, it was a warning. A reminder of how faith, isolation, and obsession can twist into something monstrous. This is the story of the Coleman compound and the nightmare born within it. Before we unravel this story, take a second to hit that like button, subscribe, and share this video with someone who loves true documentaries. It helps the channel grow, but more importantly, it means we can keep digging into hidden histories just like this. Trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming. The morning of October 15th, 2003 began in silence on a narrow Kentucky back road. A state worker drove cautiously, expecting routine truancy paperwork, never realizing he was about to uncover one of America's darkest family secrets. The dirt path narrowed as dense trees pressed inward, branches forming a tunnel that seemed to swallow daylight. At the end of the track appeared a weathered compound, an ominous structure half hidden by mist and neglect. The house looked less like a home than a relic from another century. Its boards sagged under the weight of years, windows shuttered, roof patched with tin. The silence felt heavier than stone. He stepped from the car, boots sinking into soft mud. The air smelled of smoke and damp earth, thick and sour. The compound appeared abandoned, yet faint movement flickered behind cracked curtains, suggesting unseen eyes inside. The man climbed the warped porch, noting carved markings etched into wood crosses, biblical numbers, strange initials. He knocked once, then again. The sound echoed unnaturally, swallowed by the stillness. No footsteps approached. The air grew colder. Then suddenly the door creaked open. 12 boys stood crowded together, eyes unblinking, expressions oddly vacant. Their clothes were ragged, hair unkempt, bodies thin. Each bore features that seemed unsettlingly alike, as though shadows of one another. The worker froze. The children's faces carried visible distortions, jaws misshapen, foreheads too wide, eyes that failed to align. Some twitched involuntarily. Others swayed like they could barely hold themselves upright. Silence hung over them like a curse. One boy shuffled forward, attempting speech, but words emerged as broken fragments. Another rocked rhythmically, humming without tone. None displayed the awareness expected of their ages. Confusion, fear, and genetic suffering seemed etched into every gesture. The worker, heart pounding, asked where their fathers were. The boys looked at each other, then back at him, speaking names that overlapped. They pointed toward the rear of the house, muttering reverent tones. 4 men emerged slowly from the shadows of the interior. Their features mirrored those of the children's similar deformities, subtle yet undeniable. They were brothers. Their movements were sluggish, deliberate, as though even walking required concentration. The state worker's breath caught. He was staring at a living puzzle of bloodlines twisted upon themselves. Fathers and uncles blurred into the same men. Sons became indistinguishable from cousins. The entire structure of kinship seemed deliberately inverted. The eldest of the men, gaunt yet commanding, stepped forward. His voice was steady but eerie, reciting scripture in fragments. He introduced himself as James Coleman, naming his brothers Daniel, Matthew, and Elijah. They welcomed the visitor with unsettling calm, insisting nothing was wrong. The children, they said, were chosen blessed by God. Their unusual appearance was evidence of divine favor, not sickness. Their household was sacred, untouched by worldly corruption. The worker, fighting unease, scanned the dim interior. Bare wooden floors stretched into rooms cluttered with crude beds. Handwritten texts filled shelves. Biblical verses scrawled across walls. No sign of modern life existed, no appliances, no toys, no schooling materials. The boys followed him with vacant stares, their bodies jerking with nervous tics. He realized many could not walk steadily. Several clung to others for balance, as though balance itself had become foreign to their development. The brothers explained proudly that the children belonged to all of them. No distinctions mattered between father and uncle, between brother and son. Blood was shared. Roles were blurred, their words dripped with conviction and rehearsed certainty. The worker recognized deliberate construction, a breeding system disguised as faith. What looked like madness was practiced order. A hidden doctrine dictated their lives, every child born into a family tree that looped back upon itself endlessly. He pressed for details. James spoke of a patriarch, his late father, William, a man obsessed with scripture who believed keeping bloodlines closed meant preserving divine purity. He had trained his sons to uphold this command at any cost. William's teachings were clear. Outsiders corrupted, only kin remained pure. Marrying within brothers was sacred. Sons must be born of brothers, nephews, and cousins raised as one. Diversity was sin. Concentration of blood was devotion. The worker realized the nightmare extended decades. William had planted seeds of faith twisted into obsession, convincing his sons that devotion meant breeding within their circle. 12 boys, malformed yet alive, stood as proof of his distorted legacy. Stepping deeper inside, the worker noticed crude charts nailed to walls. Names repeated endlessly, lines circling back upon themselves. It was genealogy rewritten as entrapment, diagrams of a family collapsing inward like a dying star. The children approached curiously, tugging at his sleeves, mumbling indistinct sounds. Their hands bore deformities, webbed fingers, stiff joints, swollen knuckles. He swallowed hard, knowing these marks were not chance. They were the echoes of genetic collapse. One boy attempted to smile, lips twisting awkwardly, revealing missing teeth. Another crawled instead of walking, dragging twisted legs across the floor. Their existence was haunting, as though innocence had been consumed by inherited burdens. The brothers continued speaking in biblical tones, quoting Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They claimed to be reviving ancient practices, restoring holy purity long abandoned. Disabilities were not failures, they argued, but evidence of divine election. The worker, struggling to remain professional, felt dread flood his chest. He saw not just children, but victims of a calculated system. He knew at once this discovery would demand intervention beyond anything his office had faced. He excused himself, retreating toward the porch. The air outside felt poisonous now, the trees pressing closer, the house looming like a shrine to suffering. His hands shook as he fumbled with his radio to call for backup. He reported what he had found: 12 genetically damaged boys, 4 brothers raising them, conditions unfit for human survival. His voice cracked as he described unbiblical fanaticism and children incapable of basic development. Within hours, unmarked vehicles rumbled up the dirt track. Officers, social workers, and medical staff emerged cautiously. They stepped into the compound, their expressions hardening with each sight of the children, each glimpse of carved scripture. The brothers remained calm, insisting outsiders had no right to interfere. They claimed law was irrelevant compared to divine command. Their unity was unshaken, their belief absolute. They stood together, guardians of a failing bloodline. The children huddled, eyes wide, confusion thick. Some clung to their fathers, others muttered scripture fragments. Their world had never known outsiders, never known alternatives. Their lives were bound by walls, rituals, and doctrines passed down. Medical staff examined the boys quickly, noting developmental collapse at every level: neurological delays, physical deformities, cognitive impairment. It was, one doctor muttered, a living textbook of inbreeding depression. Yet it was deliberate, not accidental. Authorities struggled with disbelief. This wasn't simple neglect. It was systematic engineering, an experiment in closed bloodlines conducted without science, only scripture. A family designed itself into catastrophe, children born not by accident, but ritualized command. The lead investigator spoke with James privately. James explained their purpose with pride. Their children were proof of loyalty to William's covenant. Each birth was sacrifice, each deformity confirmation that God had marked them specially. The interviewers pressed, didn't they see the suffering? James shook his head. Pain was proof of purity. Weakness was holiness. Each twisted limb and stunted mind was a badge of heaven's attention. He believed every word. Meanwhile, officers searched rooms. They found journals filled with coded schedules, tracking rotations between brothers, conceiving children month by month. The pattern was intentional, maximizing constant pregnancies to fulfill William's prophecy of concentrated lineage. The charts showed every conception recorded meticulously. Each child marked with multiple fathers, uncle, and father interchangeable. It was less a family than an ongoing ritual, carefully planned and executed without deviation for nearly a decade. Medical teams carried the boys outside for evaluation. Some resisted, clutching doors, terrified of leaving. Others stumbled blindly, light-hurting eyes unaccustomed to daylight. Their cries carried the weight of years without understanding or freedom. The compound, once secret, now became an exposed stage. Neighbors whispered, horrified they had never known. Officials muttered disbelief. The brothers stood silently on their porch, faces stern, convinced persecution had arrived to test their devotion. Within 48 hours, news spread. The Coleman compound was labeled the most extreme case of systematic incest ever uncovered in Kentucky. Files thickened with photographs, genetic assessments, and witness reports that would haunt investigators forever. The boys were transferred to hospitals, their lives suddenly fractured between old beliefs and new realities. Doctors shook heads at conditions left untreated for years. Social workers debated how to separate children from the men they defended. James and his brothers remained unshaken. They prayed loudly, reciting verses in holding cells. To them, arrest meant confirmation that their bloodline was chosen. They feared nothing but dilution of what William had created decades earlier. The worker who first knocked on the door sat sleepless that night. He could not erase the vacant stares, the twisted limbs, the chilling certainty of men convinced suffering was salvation. He knew this was only beginning. For the state, this discovery opened a labyrinth of questions. How had this gone unnoticed so long? How many generations already collapsed? How could children so broken still cling to loyalty? None had answers, only haunting silence. The Coleman compound stood abandoned, boarded by authorities. Yet echoes remained, symbols carved into beams, genealogies circling endlessly, prayers etched into walls. It was more than a house. It was evidence of devotion warped into genetic ruin. Thus began the investigation that would consume Kentucky's welfare system for years. The 12 boys were no longer hidden, but their future remained uncertain. The brothers' legacy was alive, embodied in each child's fractured body and mind. And though authorities had ended their isolation, the questions lingered. Could innocence survive indoctrination so complete? Could science undo damage woven into every cell? Could society confront a family who believed catastrophe was holiness incarnate? The discovery was only the first act in a tragedy still unfolding. Behind the silence of the Kentucky hills, 12 boys had lived as proof of devotion twisted into disaster. Their lives would never be the same. The story of the Coleman compound did not begin with the discovery in 2003. Its roots stretched back nearly 3 decades earlier, when a single man's obsession reshaped an entire bloodline. That man was William Coleman. William was born in the late 1940s, raised in a small Appalachian community, steeped in fire and brimstone preaching. From childhood, he fixated on Old Testament patriarchs Abraham, Isaac, Jacob men, who kept bloodlines within their own households. To him, they represented divine perfection. By adolescence, William's fascination hardened into obsession. While other boys pursued ordinary lives, he pored over scripture, memorizing passages about purity and inheritance. He convinced himself God required modern families to mirror ancient genealogies preserved within holy text. Neighbors recalled William as intense, stern, and secretive. He rarely laughed, rarely smiled. Every conversation circled back to purity, obedience, and blood. By his early 20s, he had isolated himself from companions who questioned his views. When William inherited a modest sum, he purchased 50 acres in Harlan County, far from prying eyes. On that land, he built a house of rough timber, declaring it a sanctuary where worldly corruption could never enter. The house became both fortress and temple. Each board carried meaning, each nail hammered with ritual prayer. He envisioned not just shelter, but an ark, a vessel to preserve what he considered God's chosen bloodline in modern times. As years passed, William grew more extreme. He rejected churches, claiming they had become corrupted by compromise. His only authority was his interpretation of Scripture. Outsiders were dismissed as tainted. Only kin could be trusted. Only kin could continue. He married within his extended family, producing 4 sons, James, Daniel, Matthew, and Elijah. From their earliest days, he raised them not as individuals but as instruments for a singular mission: purify the line, reject all external influence. Their education was crafted entirely by William. He wrote lessons himself, combining biblical passages with crude arithmetic and copied genealogies. Science was rejected unless it confirmed Scripture. History was rewritten to prove every nation collapsed through mixed bloodlines. Morning lessons included prayers, affirming loyalty to family first, world second. Afternoons were spent in labor building fences, clearing fields, reciting verses. At night, William drilled them on purity until the words became reflex, indistinguishable from thought itself. The brothers never played with neighborhood children. They never attended public school. Outsiders were described as diseased, sinful, contaminated. Their only companions were one another. Their only reality was their father's constructed universe, a cage disguised as covenant. William's obsession deepened after the death of his own father. He claimed visions confirmed his mission. That blood must never dilute. That chosen families must sacrifice comfort for purity. He told his sons their destiny was absolute. By adolescence, the brothers no longer questioned his authority. His teachings were absolute law. They believed outsiders carried poison in their very veins, and that any union beyond their circle would destroy what God had promised. William began drafting a covenant. In leather-bound journals, he scribbled intricate charts, cycles, and rotations. He planned how his sons would share responsibilities, how offspring would be born of multiple fathers yet remain within one contained lineage. He told them marriage, as the outside world defined it, was a corruption. Real loyalty meant brothers standing together as one. Sons must be fathered collectively. Family identity must circle inward forever, never bending outward. The journals became scripture to the brothers. They were taught that suffering and deformity were marks of favor, signs of blood untainted by outsiders. Any child born weak was not shame, but proof of chosen status. By the mid-1990s, William's health declined. His lungs weakened from decades of coal dust and untreated illness. Even as his body failed, his voice remained powerful. He spent his last years imprinting final instructions upon his sons. He emphasized the rotation months where each brother shared duties with another, ensuring every conception came from within. He described this as holy geometry, each child simultaneously son and nephew, designed to bind the family tighter. The compound itself was remodeled to reflect this doctrine. Bedrooms were arranged for rotations. Journals mapped fertility cycles. Scripture was painted on walls. Everything reinforced a system where individuality dissolved into a singular genetic mission. In 1998, William died. His passing did not end the doctrine. Instead, elevated him into legend. The brothers spoke of him as prophet, his words sacred, his instructions untouchable. They vowed to continue without deviation. For them, grief was transformed into resolve. William's death was framed as a test. Could they prove loyalty by maintaining his plan without guidance? Their answer was unanimous. They would honor his design with every breath. The following years saw the covenant enacted fully. Rotations were observed rigidly, journals updated with each conception. 12 boys emerged from this system, each bearing the unmistakable weight of collapse written into their very bodies. Yet the brothers saw not collapse, but triumph. To them, each boy's suffering confirmed William's prophecy. Outsiders would never understand. Only chosen blood could endure such burdens and remain alive. They believed their household stood closer to heaven. Outsiders occasionally caught glimpses of the compound, but never penetrated its secrecy. The brothers rehearsed answers for anyone curious, deflecting suspicion with talk of religion and farming. Behind walls, however, they nurtured a world that spiraled inward. William's journals remained central. Each page was treated like scripture. Lines described cycles of conception, verses linked to genealogical charts, diagrams resembling sacred blueprints. The brothers guarded them fiercely, believing within lay divine mathematics for survival. The children were raised to chant William's teachings. Each morning they recited affirmations declaring themselves chosen, unique, superior. They learned that pain was a badge, weakness, proof of purity. They had no concept of an alternative existence. Visitors rarely came, but when they did, the compound performed rehearsed theater. Children hid deformities. Brothers spoke calmly of prayer and farming. Outsiders left puzzled, but unconvinced of wrongdoing. The secrecy bought them nearly a decade. What William built was more than belief, it was architecture of control. He constructed reality so tightly that his sons could not imagine underworld. Every ritual reinforced loyalty. Every journal entry replaced questioning with obedience. The plan succeeded until 2003, when truancy officials stepped into the compound and saw the truth. But to understand their shock, one must recognize how carefully William's legacy prepared his sons to believe catastrophe was salvation. Even in court later, James and his brothers defended William as prophet. They quoted his verses, displayed his journals, insisted they were preserving holiness. They could not distinguish between devotion and destruction. To them, both were identical. Medical experts called it the most deliberate experiment in inbreeding ever documented. Religious scholars called it a heresy. Law enforcement called it abuse. But the brothers called it loyalty, unchanging loyalty to William's plan. The father's plan was not madness alone. It was method, ritual, and conviction forged into one. Every boy born carried proof. Every deformity echoed William's voice. Every chart drawn was his scripture lived through blood. And so, decades after William first retreated into the Kentucky hills, his covenant survived through his sons. What began as obsession became inheritance. What began as one man's vision became 12 boys' lifelong burden. The discovery in 2003 did not expose only children in need. It exposed a philosophy, a doctrine twisted into biology. A father's plan had outlived him, binding every generation that followed into ruin. The state would dismantle the compound, courts would imprison the brothers, doctors would study the boys, but none could erase William's words from their minds. His plan remained etched deeper than bone into faith itself. Even today, those who survive speak his name with mixed reverence and fear. They cannot forget the patriarch who convinced sons that isolation was sacred, blood was holy, and collapse itself was proof of purity. Thus, the nightmare endured because one man's plan was executed with discipline. The world calls it tragedy. The Colemans still call it loyalty. And William Coleman's covenant remains one of the darkest legacies ever uncovered. Life inside the Coleman compound was ruled by a rhythm so rigid it resembled a monastic order. Every hour was scripted. Every movement reflected their father's doctrine. Freedom existed nowhere within those timber walls. Dawn began with prayer. The brothers gathered their sons in the central room, their voices rising in unison. They thanked God for purity, cursed outsiders, and reminded the boys that their blood marked them holy. After prayer, chores began. The compound produced everything it consumed. The boys hauled water from a creek, split firewood, and tended fields. Even the youngest carried burdens, their twisted limbs struggling against impossible tasks. Meals followed rituals too. Before eating, verses were recited. Bread was broken slowly, each piece representing sacrifice. Water was blessed as divine inheritance. Nothing entered the body without scriptural framing, binding even hunger to doctrine. Education occurred in the same dim room where prayer began. Lessons came from William's handwritten texts, copied from scripture, distorted by commentary. The boys learned genealogies by heart, memorizing lineages that looped back endlessly on themselves. Arithmetic was limited to biblical numerology. Multiplication tables dissolved into sacred symbols. The idea of modern mathematics never entered their world. To them, numbers were holy codes proving their father's covenant through hidden equations. Science was outlawed except when confirming scripture. Illnesses were explained as trials of faith. Deformities were divine marks. Any curiosity about natural law was crushed, replaced by rehearsed chants that blamed outsiders for corruption. Afternoons were consumed by labor. The boys tilled soil, repaired fences, or gathered firewood. Their bodies ached, but complaints were silenced. Pain was considered holy evidence of obedience. Suffering was exalted as divine confirmation. Evenings returned to prayer. Candles flickered against rough walls, casting long shadows. The brothers stood before their sons, reading William's journals aloud. Each entry was delivered like prophecy, further reinforcing the belief their bloodline was sacred. Punishments maintained order. When a boy faltered in chores or stuttered verses, discipline was swift. Beatings were followed by sermons. Tears were interpreted as weakness, a stain to be burned away through ritual correction. The compound itself mirrored their doctrine. Bedrooms were arranged to reflect the rotation, each space designed for shared fatherhood. Children slept in communal dormitories, separated by age, stripped of individual identity, raised only as extensions of covenant. Symbols filled every wall. Crosses carved deep into beams, charts of genealogies hung beside scripture. The house itself became scripture, architecture embodying William's vision. Every surface reminded the boys they were bound to his plan. Privacy did not exist. Every act was communal: sleeping, eating, laboring, praying. The boys never experienced solitude. Their individuality dissolved in a collective identity drilled into them daily, reminding them they existed only as bloodline vessels. Questions were forbidden. When a boy asked why outsiders lived differently, he was corrected harshly. Curiosity was sin. Doubt was treason. To ask was to invite corruption, and corruption threatened the entire covenant's survival. The brothers themselves remained enforcers and teachers. They lived as guardians of William's plan, rarely smiling, rarely softening. Their conversations circled endlessly around scripture, purity, and blood. Fatherhood meant surveillance, indoctrination, and obedience, never warmth. Music in the compound was limited to chants. Songs consisted of scripture lines repeated rhythmically. Melody was absent. The sound resembled dirges, droning reminders that joy belonged only to heaven, never to earthly existence. Celebrations centered only on births. Each newborn boy was declared holy. His deformities were interpreted as divine evidence of loyalty. Instead of mourning weakness, they praised it, framing every abnormality as proof of chosen heritage. Games were absent. Play did not exist. When boys mimicked wrestling or laughter, they were scolded. Energy had to serve chores or scripture. Innocence was crushed early, redirected into William's endless cycle of ritualized labor. The compound's library contained nothing from outside. Only William's journals and Bibles filled shelves. The boys copied texts by hand, filling endless notebooks. Literacy meant repetition of sacred words, never exploration of ideas beyond doctrine. When sickness struck, no doctor entered. Herbs were boiled, prayers recited, hands laid on trembling bodies. Medical care was rejected as faithless. If a boy survived, it was considered divine approval. If he died, divine selection. Disabilities grew worse as years passed, yet none were acknowledged as genetic collapse. Crooked spines, twisted legs, and slow minds were interpreted as holy signs. Their suffering became the brothers' strongest evidence that purity endured. Visitors rarely came, but when they did, the family presented rehearsed illusions. Boys dressed in cleaner clothes, verses recited more calmly, deformities hidden behind careful placement. Outsiders left uneasy but unconvinced of deeper horrors. Isolation remained total. No radio, no television, no books, no letters. The outside world ceased to exist. For the boys, the compound was the universe. Beyond the hills lay only contamination and death. Even weather was framed spiritually. Storms meant divine warning. Sunlight symbolized favor. Every natural occurrence was reduced to theology. The brothers interpreted clouds, wind, and rain as sermons from God confirming William's sacred design. The boys themselves bonded only through shared burden. They nursed each other's wounds, carried each other through weakness, whispered rehearsed prayers together. Brotherhood within brotherhood became their only form of comfort, solidarity within confinement. Yet, even in silence, cracks appeared. Older boys sometimes stared beyond tree lines, eyes questioning. They never spoke aloud, but their gazes betrayed hunger for something else, something beyond endless repetition of William's holy cycle. Night rituals ended each day. Boys knelt in lines, chanting until exhaustion dragged them down. They slept on rough bedding, bodies pressed together, dreams haunted by scripture and punishments. The compound never allowed genuine rest. The smell of smoke, wood, and sweat filled every room. The house seemed to breathe with them, groaning at night, whispering in wind. It felt alive, but its voice was always William's, echoing through memory and text. Each brother carried responsibility. James, stern and commanding, oversaw discipline. Daniel handled scripture lessons. Matthew managed labor in fields. Elijah maintained records, drawing charts obsessively. Together, they formed pillars of William's covenant, ensuring no deviation occurred. Generational time blurred. Seasons passed unnoticed. Births punctuated years like clockwork. The compound lived in cycles, untethered from history, politics, or society. To them, America did not exist. Only scripture, land, and William's sacred voice. The boys grew but never matured. Without models of adulthood beyond their fathers, they mirrored them. Their language, expressions, and beliefs were echoes. They became men in form but remained children in thought, bound permanently to William. Any attempt at individuality collapsed. A boy who carved symbols differently was corrected. One who walked away during chants was dragged back. Uniformity was absolute. Survival meant disappearing into collective identity, becoming another vessel of covenant. Dreams themselves were colonized. If a boy confessed seeing outsiders in his sleep, he was told demons tempted him. Nightmares were reframed as holy warnings. Even subconscious rebellion was pulled back into doctrine. Despite discipline, affection flickered among boys themselves. They held each other when punishments ended, whispered comfort, shielded younger ones during labor. These quiet moments of solidarity became their only rebellion, tenderness surviving within brutal ritual. The Khan's isolation grew darker as William's memory thickened. His absence became presence. His words were repeated constantly, his journals quoted daily. Though dead, he ruled every decision. His authority eclipsed life itself, transcending into myth. The boys never questioned whether William was right. They lacked tools to compare. Without outside examples, his plan seemed logical, inevitable, natural. For them, deformity was not tragedy. It was the only reality imaginable. Yet reality strained against belief. Some boys collapsed from illness untreated. Others failed to walk, speak, or grow. Even the brothers occasionally faltered, voices cracking during sermons, eyes betraying knowledge they dared not admit aloud. Still, life inside continued, rituals repeated endlessly. Rotations observed strictly, births celebrated fervently, punishments enforced mercilessly, each day folded into another. The compound consumed years like a fire devouring logs, leaving nothing but smoke and ash. And so the Coleman household became more than a family. It became an experiment in control, a shrine to William's obsession, a prison disguised as paradise. Life inside was not life, it was captivity eternal. When state authorities entered the Coleman compound, they carried more than clipboards and cameras. They carried disbelief. What they found defied training, precedent, and imagination. 12 broken boys, 4 unyielding brothers, and a philosophy hardened into flesh. The removal began in chaos. Boys screamed, clung to door frames, and recited verses drilled into them since birth. They feared outsiders more than death. Every tear reflected indoctrination so complete it blurred love with captivity. Officers pried small hands from wood, carried trembling bodies into waiting vans. Some boys fought violently despite frail limbs, convinced demons waited beyond the tree line. Their fathers shouted scripture, voices echoing through Kentucky hills like defiant sermons. James, Daniel, Matthew, and Elijah were arrested without resistance, yet their eyes burned with certainty. They believed persecution proved purity. Shackles on wrists became crowns in their minds. They entered cells still whispering William's covenant aloud. In hospitals, doctors examined the boys with stunned horror. Bones curved unnaturally, organs malformed, speech broken. Medical charts filled with terms rarely seen outside laboratories. Yet beneath science lay tragedy. Every abnormality was preventable, yet deliberately embraced. Geneticists describe the case as unprecedented. Dozens of mutations stacked across siblings. Neurological deficits compounded with structural deformities. The family had effectively created a closed-loop experiment in collapse, generations compressed into 8 years of devastation. Therapists encountered equal devastation of mind. The boys could not define fatherhood, brotherhood, or individuality. To them, all men were fathers, all children sons, all suffering wholly. Identity itself had been erased by William's design. Social workers faced impossible tasks. Foster homes could not accommodate such severe needs. Institutions became the only option. Separation fractured the boys further. They mourned not freedom, but exile from the covenant they believed divine. In courtrooms, prosecutors outlined charges: abuse, neglect, criminal incest. Yet defense attorneys argued indoctrination. They claimed the brothers were victims of William's theology, prisoners themselves of faith distorted into obsession. Law wrestled with theology in tense chambers. James spoke defiantly before the judge. He quoted scripture, insisted no law could overrule covenant. His voice shook not from fear, but passion. He declared his sons chosen, his brothers faithful, his father prophetic. Prosecutors countered with photographs, twisted spines, shrunken limbs, eyes vacant. They described suffering unchosen, inflicted deliberately. They argued children had become sacrifices to doctrine, their lives currency for loyalty. Jurors wept hearing testimony from doctors and investigators. Ultimately, sentences were handed down, decades of imprisonment for each brother, yet even within bars they prayed. They formed small congregations in cells, repeating William's verses, converting their confinement into further proof of righteousness. Meanwhile, the boys' futures unfolded unevenly. Some adapted slowly, learning speech, walking with assistance, discovering worlds beyond fences. Others never progressed, trapped by irreversible damage. A few died young, bodies unable to withstand accumulated defects. Medical staff called survivors miracles, yet miracles carried scars. Every step required aid. Every sentence demanded therapy. Independence remained elusive. Their lives became case studies for genetics, psychology, and the resilience of children shaped by fanaticism. The state of Kentucky reeled. How had such a compound gone unnoticed? How have officials missed years of absence from schools, hospitals, and records? Investigations exposed failures in systems meant to protect the most vulnerable. Policies changed. Truancy checks became stricter. Social workers received new training on religious isolation. Genetic counselors contributed expertise to child welfare. The Coleman case became mandatory study for professionals confronting secrecy masked by scripture. Academics analyzed William's doctrine. Theological scholars dissected his interpretations, calling them distortions designed for control. Geneticists published papers citing the compound as evidence of how quickly collapse occurs when diversity is eliminated. The family became infamous footnotes in science. For the boys themselves, fame brought no comfort. They lived under observation, studied by strangers, pitied by media. Some longed to return to the compound, Unable to separate identity from covenant, freedom felt like exile without end. Decades later, the eldest survivors remain dependent adults. Michael, once the strongest, lives in a supervised home, functioning at a child's level. His brothers struggle in institutions, forever needing care. Independence lies beyond their reach, sealed by blood. 3 did not survive adolescence. Organ failure claimed one. Respiratory collapse took another. A third succumbed to seizures. Their graves became silent memorials to a doctrine that demanded sacrifice until bodies could no longer endure. Society debates still. Was this religion gone mad or abuse disguised as faith? Were the brothers criminals or indoctrinated instruments of William's obsession? Did sincerity mitigate cruelty? Legal and ethical arguments continue unresolved even today. For social workers who entered first, the memories linger. They speak of vacant stares, twisted limbs, whispered chants. They recall silence heavier than screams, a silence born from decades of indoctrination stronger than walls themselves. The compound itself decays, reclaimed by weeds and rot. Windows broken, scripture faded, journals scattered. Yet locals avoid the site, calling it cursed. Some swear they still hear chanting carried by wind through hollow boards. What endures is legacy. William's covenant ended in collapse, but its scars ripple outward through institutions caring for survivors. Through policies reshaped by tragedy, through lessons written into textbooks for generations of doctors, lawyers, and social workers. Yet, at the heart remains human cost. 12 boys born innocent, shaped into vessels for obsession. Their childhoods stolen, their futures fractured. Their suffering speaks louder than any doctrine, echoing warnings across time and generations. Experts caution society must remain vigilant. Isolation breeds danger when unchecked. Faith becomes weapon when twisted by obsession. The Coleman compound proved how devotion can disguise destruction, how loyalty can transform into chains binding children into ruin. And still, questions linger. Could intervention have come earlier? Could lives have been spared suffering? Could William's grip have been broken before his sons inherited the covenant? Answers remain elusive, shadows across history's record. Survivors continue their days quietly, rarely speaking publicly. Their lives unfold behind institutional walls, defined not by choice, but care. Each carries the covenant's weight, each breath reminder of an inheritance they never asked to bear. For James, Daniel, Matthew, and Elijah, prison walls eventually replaced timber walls, yet their faith never faltered. They spoke of William as prophet, their sentences as persecution, their children as chosen, their covenant unbroken in spirit. Their story challenges society still. How do we confront belief systems that destroy children while masquerading as devotion? How do we protect the vulnerable without condemning sincere faith? The Coleman case remains caution without clear resolution. Historians now classify it as one of America's darkest family tragedies. Geneticists call it an experiment conducted in flesh. Theologians call it heresy. Yet for the brothers, it was simply loyalty, obedience to their father's plan. The compound's ruins stand as monument. Every beam, every carving, every journal left behind tells the story of obsession sculpted into daily life. They warn future generations what happens when faith rejects science, when isolation reigns. William Coleman never lived to see collapse, yet his voice shaped decades beyond death. His covenant outlasted him, destroying lives he claimed to sanctify. His sons believed him prophet. His grandsons bore the cost. Collapse and legacy intertwine. The covenant crumbled under scrutiny, yet its memory remains. Its collapse freed children from captivity, yet its legacy reminds us captivity can be built quietly, within walls disguised as sanctuaries. And so the story ends not with resolution, but with reminder. The Coleman boys live on, scarred survivors of devotion, twisted into nightmare. Their fathers remain imprisoned prophets of ruin. Their grandfather's plan endures only as warning.